Welcome to this TIA series on technology impact assessment. My name is Katina Michael, and this interview is part of the Australia-India Joint Impact Assessment of Critical Technologies for Peace and Stability. It's a project funded by the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade in Australia and has been ongoing since November 2024. It gives me great pleasure to introduce and welcome Roger Clarke.
Hello, Katina.
Well, Professor Roger Clarke is the president of Zamex Consultancy, a consulting company that has been going for many decades in the space of electronic commerce. He's also a professor emeritus of the Australian National University, where he worked for many, many years. Can't really think of anyone better to talk to us about technology impact assessment, in particular because you have been the chair of the Australian Privacy Foundation, among many other posts. But if we begin, I always wonder what you're up to, Roger, but what are you presently engaged in?
Um, yes, a range of things, Katina, as always. A great deal of my time's been taken up by work on the board of the Australian Computer Society. But when I'm doing constructive things instead of politics and running large organizations or helping run large organizations, I've been doing a lot of work on AI and Gen AI, and specifically on responsible application of them, the possibility of it being responsible, which is actually quite a challenge in the first place, even if you have a desire to be responsible. Knowing what to do about it is a problem. I've continued and having to go back to some of my bits and pieces of work on robotics and sub-organization because they're converging into a complex um, of infrastructure which will underlie an awful lot of what goes on in the near future. So those are the sorts of things I've been spending most of my time on recently.
So thanks for sharing that, Roger. I also want to share an article that you've had published in the IEEE Transactions on Technology and Society on the topic of technological impact assessment, and you've named it as a framework for designing a TIA project method. This whole interview really focuses on technology impact assessment, and I really encourage people to reach out. It is on early access in IEEE Explore, and will soon hit a volume and issue in 2026. But how does this notion of technology impact assessment relate to your work over the years?
Well, the second half of my 55, 58-year career, working period, has been basically on talking to executives in business and government about the strategic and policy impacts and implications of various kinds of technologies. I've had to use advanced, I've had to use transformative, I've had to use disruptive. You've got to use the words that the clients are using at the time, which they pick up from the hype merchants. But let's face it, they are at least transformative, and some of them are seriously disruptive, as we're seeing currently. So I've been living and breathing this professionally for a long time, and every now and again I sit back and ask myself some questions and do some research and publish a little bit on it. And that's where this particular paper that you put up came from. The previous cycles have been in the risk assessment space. Not well in very recent times. We'll probably end up talking about that a little bit later, Katina. Both of us. Earlier ones have been other kinds of evaluation techniques because there are so many of them: cost benefit analysis, business case formulation. There's all sorts of different ways of looking at things. So I've been through this cycle many times over the last good 25 to 30 years. So yes, I've lived and breathed it.
You've published in the past extensively and also consulted extensively to clients both here in Australia and abroad on the notion of privacy impact assessment and other types of risk assessments. How closely aligned is this to you when you think about technology impact assessment?
Of the probably 15 or so definable techniques that are around, PIAs are probably pretty close to the nearest thing, but remember that the focus is on an outcome rather than on a means whereby that outcome arises. So a privacy impact assessment will take as given an environmental disturbance or some context, and will then say, well, what happens next, and then what do we do about it? So it's a bit more downstream, but it has similarities in a number of ways. One of which is that to do a PIA is distinct from a data protection impact assessment, which is all they do in Europe, um, or a statutory compliance assessment, which is all they do in Canada and the United States. A real PIA looks at the broad question, and the broad question is at many levels. Individuals have an interest in privacy. Groups, communities, households have interests in privacy. And there are many conflicting interests for the individual themselves, for the household, for various levels of society and economy and polity. So there's many, many perspectives that have to be brought to bear when you're doing a privacy impact assessment. There is no such thing as privacy rules and everything else must bow down before it. No, privacy has to be balanced against many other interests. And that's the kind of thing that we've got with a TIA as well. So that's one close similarity and probably the closest of all of the various techniques.
You have defined technology impact assessment in your article on the IEEE transactions on technology and society. And my question really pertains to what is it and why the focus on technology?
Yes, there are many other ways to do it. A social impact assessment or a human rights impact assessment is a perfectly legitimate way to undertake a study if that's your objective. And of course, we do all have to stand back and say, dear client or dear society, what is it you actually wanted to know? What do you perceive to be the problem area? Yes, technology is important because the extent to which the power of individual technologies has increased over the last 50 years during my time. Remembering that I started in the early days of computers when we were dealing with tape drives. I did actually work on purely serial devices before disk drives existed. The power increase has been extraordinary, and the convergence across different elements of technology has also been enormous. Originally, it was computers and communications. Now it's a given. You don't think about a computer very much without assuming the communications component. That didn't used to be the case 40 years ago. Now we've got all of these other elements drawing in together as well. So technology is an important focus for us to have. And then to ask the question, given a technology or a cluster of technologies or an application of a particular technology or cluster, given that thing that we're interested in, so what? Where do we go from here? And then come all the other elements within the definition as I approach it.
DFAT and our partner institutions in India were looking at technology impact assessment and its role for peace and stability. What might that constitute and conjure up in your eyes? And if not in a geopolitical context, perhaps peace and stability within the Australian context alone or an organizational context, in any context you wish to cover.
Yes, this is about my weakest point within the whole
Mm.
discussion area that you've run in this excellent project. So I paused and thought about what can I reasonably say here. And yes, I can say something, but you'll have to understand that it's relatively superficial and preliminary thinking. But the way I look at it is this: because of this enormous growth in impact of the technologies we're dealing with, and because there's been a technocratic movement within business and government in recent times, digitalization, I don't know whether I should talk a little bit around digitalization to make clear what we mean or what should be meant by that. Um, um, in the past, say up to the turn of the recent century, around 2000, there was still a lot of analog data around which needed to be digitized. We're now in a situation where the vast majority of the data that we have is born digital in the first place. And a huge amount of what needed to be digitized from analog form has already been digitized. So we've gone through the digitization revolution. What digitalization is depicting is, given all that data, Given that organizations are powerful enough and laws regulating them are weak enough, those organizations have access to data from many, many different sources. They can expropriate willy-nilly and call it whatever they like, buying, selling, sharing, strategic partnerships. They can use any excuse they like. They're getting access to vast quantities of data.
Mm,
Of course, they then go about ignoring the incompatibilities amongst the different sources. So the quality of data once it's merged is far worse than it was in its original state, or each element was in its original state. But they are depending on that data. They're finding it much cheaper and easier. They're not having to deal with horrible analog human beings. They are instead depending on a digital persona to deal with people. This silly word digital twin gets used. They're usually talking about cities and campuses and roadways, but a digital twin makes the presumption that a model is as good as the system. And it isn't by definition. A system is what is out there in the world. A model is a simplified representation of that real world system. And it is never as good as, it is not a twin. It can be a very useful model. I've done a lot of modeling. You've done a lot of modeling. We can do things with them, but don't kid ourselves that is actually the same thing, a twin. But
mm,
that's what organizations are doing. They are declining to interact with human beings. They're deflecting us, delaying us, putting us on the ends of long waiting times, and they're making their decisions based on the data alone. Of course, if we can feed some data in to change the profile a bit, then they'd love us to do that because that saves them money as well and gains more data about us. And some of them wouldn't mind those digital personae to be a bit more accurate. So they're very happy if we can inject a bit, but it's got to be on their terms in the structures that they want it in.
mm,
So the digitalization movement involves adjusting organizations, architectures, and processes and technologies to support them in such a way that they can just deal with data, draw their inferences, make their decisions, and take actions based on that alone without having to get messy with individuals. So the effect of that, of course, is that the humanity goes out of it entirely. That was part of the point. That's how you reduce costs by having fewer messy people working for you who are dealing with messy people outside your organizational boundaries, because that always burns time. There's always so many exceptions to be dealt with. Well, you can get rid of the exceptions because you can ignore them. There aren't any exceptions. My digital twin, no. My digital persona is what's right. Your problem, you need to align yourself with what we think your digital persona is. So the digitalization movement is compounding all these problems, the layer of operational use over the top of the technologies. So the way I see this going, and we see it already in the confidence levels of individuals regarding their social institutions and their economic institutions. Obviously, a lot of the economic institutions are private sector, some are government, and the inverse in the case of other kinds of socio-political institutions, a minority tend to be private sector, majority public sector. Our confidence as individuals in those things, our confidence as groups of people, as interest groups, is, well, in some circumstances, plummeting. The impact on the Australian public of robo-debt was a lot more than just, oh, those poor people, those poor 400,000 people who received letters that they shouldn't have received because they were produced by a computer and they were seriously wrong. Um, that that was just at one level. It was the horror once people found out how stupid the mistake was and how unlawful it was that the revulsion, the loss of credibility of government agencies, and with the government agencies, a lot of the private sector, who are known to use fairly similar and simplified approaches themselves, that loss of confidence could come back to haunt those organizations and us. Because the fabric of society, the fabric of economies, depends very much on belief that things are going okay, and when they don't go okay, there are ways in which we can get some adjustments. There are checks and balances. There are channels of appeal that we can go through. Well, sorry, with the new environment, those are being squashed or squelched. We are not achieving as much of that. It's being cut out because it's a cost factor, and we're trying to reduce costs, aren't we? So, in the event that we lose confidence in society's institutions, we get a
Yes.
breakdown locally, we get a breakdown regionally at subnational region. And of course, once you've got uncertainty within a country that's got another country nearby, neighboring country, or a more distant but powerful country, those things are taken notice of. That changes the political balance around the world. So the ripple effect in terms of um, undoing what we thought we'd achieved with world trade and the tying together of the world and the making of all countries rather more dependent on one another than they were in earlier times. We thought we'd made progress with that, making war a more costly thing for the organization of the nation that set out to make war. Well,
Yes.
that's going to get undone as we start losing that social cohesion locally and regionally. So I do see that as it's a second round effect. It's not a primary, but to me that is important. And clearly, I think that TIA, when it's designed the right way, when we design for the purpose, can assist in understanding what those scenarios are like, understanding what the root causes of difficulties that we're foreseeing are, and then doing something about avoiding bleak futures like that.
It's fascinating. As you say, the importance of trust at that national level towards stability. And it reminds me of a study we did back in 2006, 7, 8, with respect to emergencies and a state of emergency and the use of location-based services in emergencies with Dr. Anas Alidat. And we were waiting that privacy would be the key factor during a state of emergency and the sharing of location details, but trust came back uh, by far being the critical factor. Although, of course, a small percentage did allude to privacy, most were talking about trust. And when we think about this, it's about human securitization and trust in our institutions, trust in the organizations that provide us services, and trust in one another who may have a capability, a technological capability with respect to our personhood. But you've very well articulated the importance of that within a context of peace and stability. And it reminds me of your article. You talk about the socio-technical approaches in TIAs, the socio-political approaches, the socio-economic approaches. And I think that socio is what you're stressing, but as well as identifying these other criteria in a methodology. But how do we go about, Roger, identifying critical emerging technologies? How do you do that in a given nation state?
Yes, it is going to depend upon judgment calls by individuals. Look, there's lots of people who blow whistles early, and sometimes they end up crying wolf, to mix a few metaphors. They don't quite get it right. They're more scared of the technology than they ought to have been, or they accentuate some things that turn out not to be such a big problem after all. So some of our distant early warning people don't get it right. But there's plenty of warnings around the place, and we've got to winnow through them and listen to them, but analyze them. We've got to play our games with scenarios. Could this be realistic? Could it work like that? Hang on a tick. We need to talk to some people who actually know about these technologies. Remember, there's lots and lots of of social corners in this world, lots of them in back bedrooms with people talking to one another over networks rather than actually meeting up in pubs. And those people do have deep understanding, not just of the features of technologies, but also the affordances of those technologies. That is to say, the things that you can do with them that weren't necessarily by intent of the designer, but which the design actually facilitates. So there's a lot of people out there who know very early in the piece. Once there's a technology in beta test mode, in pilot mode, there are people with some insights. Insights, I mean,
Yes, yes.
sorry. So we can, they got them too. Uh, so getting to those people who got those insights and absorbing their ideas and talking to these subcultures, living out in them a little bit, is one of the ways to detect things and to filter out which ones should we be actually focusing on.
Yes. And so criteria and methodologies that you would use for TIA.
Okay. Well, just as a framing for the framework article, which you put up on
Yes,
screen,
please.
the framing for that is that there are many discussions about what's a good method. Now, watch this. I've got to say this every time I talk about this. The word methodology means the study of methods. It isn't a
Hmm.
method.
Hmm.
A method is the thing that you actually use on some occasion to do something with. Methodology is the discussion, the meta discussion area.
Yes.
Now, when you do a TIA, you need a method.
Hmm.
But there are so many different variations of TIAs because there are so many different dimensions and so many choices across those many different dimensions that it is up to the project team to work out what on earth the method should be that is appropriate in that context. So
Yes.
what I talk from is not here's a method because that would work in a few cases and it'd be absolutely awful in a lot of others, just a
Hmm.
misfit. So what I tried to do with that article when I was challenged as at the very beginning of your of the DFAT and India project, I asked myself, what are those dimensions? What are the major points on what spectra within those dimensions? What things should I highlight and get people to think about? Here's it's an intelligent checklist. There's no simple tick boxes in this, but here are some things to think about. This one may not be important in your context. That's fine. If you've
Yes.
evaluated that and you determine no, we'll let that one go by. We don't think that matters much this time. Work your way down, pick out the ones that matter, and then drill down on those elements that matter. So this framework has got, I haven't actually counted them, but probably an average of about 6 or 8 key terms or concepts within each of about 10 elements of the framework. And picking your way through that. Some of them, any team will have quick discussions on some of those. Say yes, that they're givens. We know about those. Move on.
Hmm.
And on others, they'll pause and pause for a long time and go away and do mini projects in order to work out. Well, what level? Let's take as an example. What level do you want to look at any particular technology in? So if you're going to talk
Yes.
about green technology, well, there's at least four, and arguably a few more. Um, and at what level do you want to do? Do you want to do offshore wind or onshore wind, or must it be both? You've got to think your way into what is the technological driver
Hmm.
that is of potential concern that we should be looking at. And sometimes the answer is, I'm sorry, very broad. We do have to look at this. Let's take as an example, how long are we going to need gas as an interim? Because nobody really doubts when they look at the numbers that we need an interim. We can phase down coal, but we need something to hold the gap. Batteries are developing, but not developing fast enough or big enough to go without some interim technologies. So, okay, maybe that's the one that any particular project might want to focus on, keeping in mind the other things around it, but with gas as a focus, for example. So
Hmm.
now that kind of challenge comes up multiple times in any discussion that we might want to have. Be it, I mean, obviously, there's so many different examples we can pick on here. Driverless cars is arriving perforce, ignoring laws in multiple countries around the world, and there's one. Well, is it the driverless car? Is it the driverless truck? Is it the only the ones that are on public roads? Are we not worried about the ones in the mines? Are we not worried about the ones that are in their own lanes?
Yes.
We've got to narrow these things down, and this framework tries to help people corral the problem, and to some extent help corral the people into coming up with sensible propositions for what a particular method should look like.
I love that description and that emphasis on level, very much linked to context. And if we stress that point, earlier you said really TIAs were about outcomes. What do you think the purpose of a TIA is, and does that change based on your description of the levels that you just introduced us to?
Yes, I've asked myself that question many times as to how you tackle this purpose thing. To some extent, of course, purpose is one of the things you start with but you've got to refine continually during the very early stages of formation of the project. You've got a vague idea of what it was the client wanted, or you wanted, or everybody wants, or the newspapers demand, or
Mm,
whatever the initial priming idea is. But the more you look at it, the more you think, I'm going to need to refine that a bit, uh, and dig down and weight some things more than others. So until you've got enough contextual variables in place and semi understood, you're not going to be able to make a determination on what the purpose is. Understanding the impact or the understanding and controlling the negative impacts of gas as a medium term interim energy source. Okay, we might be starting to hone down a little bit, but does that really satisfy some of the institutional clients who might be prepared to provide some money and resources into this? Um, does it address the burning public issues that are out there? Does it intersect in a sensible way with the current political climate and what the parties are talking about in parliaments? Each of those things has got to be jockeyed with before you can end up with the definition of purpose. Um, so the other ones I've got there are what kind of vehicle are you going to use for this? There's many different ways in which you can resource the study. It can be totally voluntary. It can be totally professional and subcontracted to the Herman Kahn Institute if you want to go back in time. Choose your current devil, or choose your current favoured, most socially aware think tank around the world and give them the contract instead. I mean, those are all different kinds of vehicles that can be used. Who's your target audience? Who are you going to influence? Because simply being able to say to the world, we've published this really great book. We recommend you buy a copy. Oh, we've even got a grant for that. It's free. Yes, that is good, but it may not change the world because got to think about where the power buttons are that can have an impact. So and time horizons. Will we miss the window of opportunity within which we could have an impact?
mm,
If I go back to the privacy situation, Michael Kirby chaired a study. Actually, he chaired the Law Reform Commission in Australia. Another one of the commissioners chaired the study, and it took 6 years before the report came out. There'd been three changes of government in that time. And the original prime minister had some interest in the outcome. If it had come out within 2.5 years, there's a chance that some momentum would have been gained. The window of opportunity was not 6 years long. So
mm.
that report, with lots of good stuff in it, quite thick, sat on a shelf and is
Yeah.
referred to by researchers. Thank you very much. It did not have that impact. So we got to think in terms of: are we doing this as for its signaling value? Are we doing this for symbolical reasons, or are we actually trying to influence the course of history in a country or the world? And the more it's the latter, the more you got to watch the time horizon in question. There's a lot of factors,
Fascinating.
isn't it?
A lot. And you know, you have done so much work as well as your f fellow collaborators in the past. And I ask this strategic question, especially given our representation in the third sector. You have been involved in not-for-profits and non-government organizations for largely the majority of your working life, and um, institutions as well, institutes as well, not just institutions and organizations. But I asked this question of a young digital health assessment collaborator in India, and I said, how is it that you tackle these big projects and these big challenges? And do you ever get overwhelmed? I just felt like asking her this question, and she says to me, no, the way you look at it, this is Shefali Malhotra, who works for a non-government organization. She says the way to look at it is you do what you do, you make it available, and you allow it to take its course. And she says, I don't think like that. Like, in the sense that for her, the actual work was the contribution and the outcome. That it will have its lifetime and it will have its shelf time. But it was fascinating to see this young, energetic voice saying, don't worry, we've got this under control in the digital health assessment space, and we know we are making an impact, even if it's not so well known to the community at large. We are making inroads bit by bit, and I just thought that was a very brave approach. I see you working so hard over since 2008-ish, and even before that, when I first met you. And I don't know how you have this capacity to keep producing this documentation. Where does that come from, Roger? Because I say this uh, in all soberness. I don't see this in many researchers today. They may publish an article, they may have a sustained agenda, but then this other work, which perhaps won't reach a publication or a journal, but it will reach a particular audience. Where does that drive come from? Is it a gift that's innate, or you see the world in a particular way, and what is that way of seeing?
Yeah. The researcher in me, if I ask myself, how would a serious researcher see me? And they'd call me a dilettante. Secondly, they'd call me too rough and ready, and too much wisdom, too little empiricism.
Mm,
And they're right, but there's a positive side, of course. If I do the opposite spin on that, by dilettante, we mean somebody who does what he thinks should be done, what he's interested in, he or she is interested in at the time, and what strikes as important. Now, I think that I've kept my eye my eye on the ball, and looked at what was important to society, polity, economy, individuals over the years, not just, oh, that looks like a technically interesting problem. I'll go and investigate that one. Quite a lot of people do that, and it's legitimate, but it doesn't have as much payback for other people as finding where the real burning questions are. I do deplore the fact in my own discipline, information systems, I find it harder and harder to get published in my own discipline because it's become formulaic.
yes.
Um, we're at the level where there's 6 or 8 forms or structures or styles that articles are written in, and mine are whatever style and structure and approach is appropriate to the topic and the kind of research I've been doing and the kind of thing I'm trying to investigate and bring forward. And I get non-comprehension and certainly inability of reviewers. Sometimes with editors is okay, but reviewers won't work with me on this. They write rejection-y kinds of things and they can't justify anything other than that. I feel uncomfortable. It
Yes.
doesn't fit any of my expectations. Now, that formalism stuff means that we are wasting an awful lot of brains in academia, and it ain't
Hmm.
just in that discipline. I
Hmm.
find it a bit less bad in some of the adjacent disciplines. Computer science is more open-minded than information systems in business schools, driven too much by the American business school ethos, if I should use the word ethos for that. Um, so, yes, I have frustrations about those things. I have another area of frustration too. And I've got to admit, one of the reasons I move a bit is that I get frustrated, much more so than Sheffield obviously does, when I don't get anywhere.
Hmm.
Now, privacy I worked on, it was really the first area I did get involved in. So let's see, I had 4 years after I left school at 17 when I wasn't involved in any civil society organisation. Since then, I've been serially and multiply involved in one or more throughout the rest of my life. Um, the um, uh, what was the point I was going to make about that? The privacy area from 1972 through to 2000, I had some traction. I've been in front of probably 40 odd privacy related parliamentary committees over the years. And the
Yes.
early years, we were listened to. They may not have done what we recommended, but they
Mm.
saw fit to note it has been submitted to us that, and they footnoted it. Our
Hmm.
response to it is. Now, 2/3 of the time, it was waved away, not as important as other things, but it was actually addressed, taken notice of. There was a half answer. That died. I do not go before parliamentary committees anymore. I gave up on it about 10 years or more ago. Once I'd reached the stage where there were never any outcomes, you're not listened to. It's also become formulaic. Parliamentary committees have become a waste of space. Now, that's particularly in the privacy space. We have, of course, in Australia, the world's worst. Um, 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 I've got to say, the world's worst law on paper. Obviously, there are countries in the world where there's even worse abuses of privacy than
Yes.
there are in Australia. But the law, as it's written, is worthless. It's been whittled away to the point where there's hardly any of it left. Um, I'm spending very little time on privacy these days, per se. I do some work on surveillance. I do some of the technology driven, if you like.
Yes.
I've gone back towards technocracy now, haven't I? It's
Yeah.
um, so those bits of social values have drifted away. There's still some consumer areas, consumer rights areas where there is more recognition,
Mm.
and that, by the way, is one of the positives that parliaments and parliamentary committees, and even some of the better government agencies, regulatory agencies, recognizes that there are real problems here in from a consumer perspective. They don't always get it right. If you take some of the stuff they're doing with child blocking children from social media and things like that, they don't always get it right, but they
Yeah.
are recognizing there's a problem and they are then trying to do something about it. Now, okay, that's driven by fear and misunderstanding a bit more than it should be, um, and by a bit too much paternalism and not giving kids any credit for being able to think for themselves or progressively learn more and more about thinking
Yes.
for themselves. So there's downsides to it, but there is at least some recognition in the consumer space, and that's good. Privacy doesn't fit into their worldview terribly well at the moment in Australia, at least. So yes, there are frustrations that I move on and do some more things and then come back again. I haven't done any
Yeah.
work on technology assessment for per se for 6, 8 years. PIA, yes, but not
Mm.
technology assessment. And then suddenly, you guys land this in my lap and say, "Tell us
Yes,
about this, Rog.
please.
Come and talk about this." Oh dear, I better go back and do some homework.
Oh,
So
that was a wonderful webinar for those who are watching and listening to this. It's available on the Social Cyber Institute, and also the compendium paper that was published in the IEEE Transactions on Technology and Society. But you raised some good points. We had Professor Anne Langley, a qualitative researcher from Montreal, speak to us at the University of Sydney recently, and she talked about us being more creative, more original. Um, being ourselves and not mimicking, you know, papers and their design, their research design, in the hope that we'd get into an A or A star. That she really called out, we need a lot more creative, qualitative research, and be true to yourselves and be true to your mission. And she talked about how to, she called it stretching towards theoretical development, but she really, she's a mathematician by training in her undergrad years and then focused on operations research. But she really said, come on, where is the true qualitative research? And start thinking smartly about doing it. But she's calling for more creativity and more originality. Uh, but I think about what's going on and why is privacy, being left behind to a degree in some of the discussions where it should be front and center. For example, AI. And I do think, Roger, it's this misnomer that because something is normal, it's been normalized in terms of behavior, that it becomes the de facto ethical standard. And if the more people doing X, therefore, the vast majority are doing X, and so that indicative becomes the normative. It's how we should be because that's how everybody acts. And sure, if we want to, forget about the fact that all this data that's being crawled, on the internet, we can forget about it. We can turn a blind eye to it. Nobody will worry if we're harvesting data uh, that's open source, and then it becomes a de facto standard. It becomes normative, and everybody says, "Oh, look, but everyone's doing it, so it's ethical." It becomes it's not just uh, we are doing this, but we ought to be doing it, but actually we ought not to be doing it, as you've said so much through decades of your own research. But we had Chris Felsted on this interview series from the Swinburne University of Technology, and I asked him the following question: who are the main stakeholders related to TIA? And he pointed back to your work. So I'm going to ask you to repeat what he said almost, but Who are the main stakeholders, Roger? You mentioned quite a few of them a moment ago, but in your eyes, who are the main stakeholders in technology impact assessments?
Again, I'm going to dive for cover and say I'm a framework person. The answer is it depends on which TIA we're talking about. But what I
Yes.
have got is a set of a checklist of things to think about as you go about identifying them in order to make sure you don't miss important people out or categories
Mm,
out. So the way I started is there has been so much focus in the past on participants in a system, or us people of a technocratic bent call them users, because that's the word we used in the 1960s. So we still call them users. Now, they are absolutely deep involved in it. So the employees are users. The people who sit there on the end of an ATM, an FPOS terminal, us on the end of a browser typing in transactions to buy things and sell things and post things, we are users. No two ways about it. Very many different categories of them, depending on the particular technology you're talking about. But what's so often overlooked is what we call usees. Now, the term's only been around since about 1990, so you'd have thought it might have got some traction by now. The point is that there are many people who are impacted by any system, not even just technological systems. Anything that's going on will have impacts on people who are not actively participating in them.
mm,
People in the same household as a person who was subject to the robo-debt fiasco. They suffered while the person in the household was suffering, not only in families, in boarding houses, because one person's looking suicidal. It's not a good feeling in a boarding house.
yes.
Um, so those people are being used by the system without themselves being involved in and participating in it. So we've always got to think about that penumbra of people affected. So usees, grab that word, do something with it.
Mm,
Um, find the categories. Um, there's then the question of stakeholder theory and in particular salience, stakeholder salience theory, which says that there are three, some people argue a fourth dimension, but three main dimensions of stakeholders. There are those that have power and those that don't. There are those that have legitimacy and there are those that don't. And there are those that have urgency and those that have don't. Now, what's happened is that business latched onto that and said, well, obviously the only ones that matter are the ones that have got power. If they can't affect what I'm doing, why should I care about them? Legitimacy is quite second order. We're not here as an ethical organisation. We've got no requirement to be ethical. In fact, there's an argument that as a as a corporation, our debt is to our shareholders, and we shouldn't be unduly concerned about ethics. We've got to get on and make profits for our shareholders, not our stakeholders. So power has turned out to be dominant in the analysis of shareholders, and others are left out. You see it in government agencies. You cannot get to involve the actual stakeholders because they're too busy thinking about the different sections within their agency and the other agencies that might stand up against them in cabinet and argue against them getting the money for their next year's projects. So it's narrowed down. So we've got to open that out again and say there are multiple factors that determine whether a stakeholder is salient or not. You've also then got to think about the subsets, the sub-segmentation. It's no good saying the customers will be affected. It's
mm,
no good saying the disabled will be affected. Horrible word. Differently abled, whatever word we're using these days.
yes, yes.
What you've got to do is say, well, hold on a tick. Blind people will be affected differently from people with one leg. Let's sort out what the segmentation is that makes sense in the current context. So that needs drilling down in each particular situation you're in. There's been a question raised in the literature on a few occasions, and we trip into it when we do things in practice as well. Is there such a concept as an abstract stakeholder that we should come up with? So should we think about the environment, the biosphere, the local swamp, and swamps, waterlines generally, water quality? So society, economy, polity, again at different degrees of granularity. And something else that's often missed out is proxies for stakeholders.
Hmm.
There are some kinds of stakeholders who haven't got a hope of understanding Gen AI,
Yes.
AI/ML, cyborgization. I mean,
Yes.
a lot of people just it would take they'd have to go to TAFE or university for a year to work out what the hell you were talking about. They
Yeah.
can't represent their own interests. Advocacy organizations or representative organizations, two different kinds of concepts in my mind. Advocates are people like me who don't really have a base of representing particular interest groups. I think I've got a reasonable idea of what they're about and what they need. Therefore, I'll try to represent their interests and advocate for them. But I have no actual moral authority to do it. I've got to
Yeah.
do it by argumentation. And if it doesn't make sense, for God's sake, tell me early, and I'll buy out of that and listen to what other people say. So finding advocates for and advocates who can represent the various different interests amongst the stakeholders. Each of those things is important. And unless you've got that degree of analysis in your early phase work in a TIA, you're going
Hmm.
to miss something and you're going to fail to represent some of the people who mattered. And of course, if they're powerful, it'll stuff up your outcomes completely.
Yes.
But if they're not
Yes.
powerful, it'll raise doubts about your ethicality and effectiveness. So, got to do that early homework on stakeholder analysis.
On this, do you advocate for the use of a rubric or a guide for TIA? And if so, what are the main elements? Or do you steer clear of rubrics and really start to think about the context?
Um, you must have context early on. You've got to get your framing right. Now, PIAs, there are some quite good guidelines written which have got sufficient flexibility built inside them
Hmm.
that you can reasonably apply that and provided you've got your context and purposes and framework and stakeholder analyses sorted out in the first place. Now, I say that with some tongue in cheek because obviously I wrote one or two of those guidelines for one or two governments around the world. Unfortunately, some of the better ones have been watered down because the bureaucrats have got to them and didn't like that bit and they tried to turn them into recipes. And there are some things that you can do as recipes, but
Mm.
if you ever look at what an American government agency does in the way of a so-called PIA, and indeed some of the Canadian provinces as well, and Canada's a much more sensible place, but some of them have got really stupid checklisty things. And it comes down to, have you satisfied the requirements of Section 13C1?
Mm.
No, that's not a privacy impact assessment. So, um, yes, we've got to have some frame.
Hmm.
We've got to nail it down a bit. Once you've decided what your TIA is, you've got to have some cohesion and coherence and consistency in what you do with your project method. You can't abandon it all because we've had some new information arrive or a new stakeholders bobbed up. Let's change everything. You've got to do some carry through once you've got some commitment. So yes, patterns and project plans do eventually matter.
Yeah. Okay. Uh, the effectiveness of the current methods of government engagement with stakeholders, what would you say? Are they effective, ineffective? What can we do better?
I haven't done a lot of government work outside Australia for the last 6, 8 years.
Mm.
I used to have Canadian, UK, Hong Kong work, and in some cases in succession. So I had a bit better feel overseas. I think I better shut up about anything outside Australia, when I make my statements here.
Mm.
Australian government agencies, particularly at federal level, have become extremely disappointing and narrow. They simply don't have the kind of commitment to what we think of as public policy.
Hmm.
They actively have been narrowed down to thinking about government policy as though that was their job. Now, there are people within the public sector in Canberra who are fighting that and who are trying to argue for genuine public policy. But when you see the textbooks and when you see the seminars that these public servants are put through, when you see the attitudes of secretaries and deputy secretaries, they have been taught by Walensky going back 30, 40 years that they are a tabula rasa on which the minister of the day paints a picture. And it is their job to enable that to happen. even if it's illegal, even if it's immoral, even if it's against the interests of the country, let alone against the interests of particular interest groups. So we've found the federal public service in particular to be extremely barren ground. They do not do stakeholder analysis. It's not just Robodebt, not by a long shot. Um, each of the various projects I've been involved in, and it's now 15 years. Well, actually, 1998 was the first time I did work on this government public key authority. So that's now 27 years that I can think of. Um, uh, each of the attempts at a national identifier, at a national authentication scheme, has been so narrowly constructed. It's been done in terms of social control objectives of the public service, not even balanced against anything. They haven't gone out and looked at the others and said, well, we're going to have some social control here, you know. A tax file number's got to have some validity, you know. We must have a way of stopping people having four of them. To
Yes.
which my answer was no. You've got to know that that person has four and which four they are.
Mm.
The bloke wants to keep that known to his wife and that known to that mistress. It's a fact of life. I'm sorry. It's
Yeah.
if you want to run an economy, you've got to face up to the realities of how that economy works. But they
Yes.
won't do it. So federal is a lost cause at the moment. States vary. Some of them, I mean, New South Wales used to be so dull and grey, and Dominatello, I call him, but the Minister for Government Services, Dominello, did an absolutely brilliant job of dragging them forward about 30 years. And
Yes.
there has been some good stuff done, but unfortunately, it's highly insensitive because he was a doer and he got people
Yes.
to be doers. So it mowed down. And of course, the privacy law is extraordinarily weak in New South Wales
Yes.
by design. So unfortunately, there's a lot of collateral damage, but he at least got some things to work. Digital driver's licenses aren't in themselves a bad idea. It's how you do them and what you build
Yes.
around them and what the protections are for the data and who gets to see what, when, and where it leaks to, where the questions arise with a license. I'm not a Luddite by and large. There's some good stuff out there. So states vary, and some of them, yes, there is hope for ability to deal from time to time. Health, of course, is extraordinarily difficult because of the complexity of the sector, the complexity of the interests involved, and the power of some of them. And it's such an important one.
It is. And I like these examples because my next question is about when TIA should be instituted, or does it evolve with a technology's life cycle in a given context? Like from all the work you've done over the years on impact assessments of different types, do you see people asking you to do them once off and then it's done? Have you ever seen someone say, Roger, I need you here and here and here throughout the life cycle? And perhaps how should we look at this with this question?
Even in the case of PIAs, the number of occasions on which I've actually done successive PIAs over an extended period is quite limited. Voice authentication, Centrelink did an absolutely brilliant job. They hired me at the very beginning, and I said I need to declare to you that I know all the advocates out there because they're quite a few of my friends. They said, "Why do you think we asked you?"
Right.
Yes, we want
Wow.
access to them. Yes, we want a consultation process. Yes, don't bring any of the dumb ones. Don't bring any of the noisy ones in. Bring in the
Mm,
ones we can talk to, we can make sense with. And then
yes.
they did three iterations and they had learnt a huge amount and they did an effective mechanism. Now, that wasn't one of the most scary technologies, but it could have been done in a very scary way.
Yes.
So that was one instance that actually worked. This now goes back quite a few years and became something of a frame for the rest of the public service. So that one was good. It can happen, but I've I have the feeling that most TIAs bob up opportunistically when there's a trigger. And that trigger can be many different kinds of things. It can be public concern. It can be a minister's promise. It can be a sudden flurry that the public service becomes very worried about, or media flax become very worried about, and suddenly there's some money floating around to do something with. Who can we give this money to? And what will they do that won't bring the government down, please? And preferably will actually add loss to our credibility. So a lot of it happens when it happens. So the stage of the technological life cycle needs to be recognised, but it's actually a fact of life that you've got to live with. When you got the money, you got to do it. One little aside on that one, I did a job for the State Library of South Australia quite a few years ago. They were given money to invest in information technology because clearly tech was going to be much, much bigger in libraries. This is before the web, but not
Hmm.
long before the web.
Yes.
And it turned out that they tend to get buckets of money about every 15 years.
Hmm.
So we had to work out what the electronic library was going to be like,
Yeah.
and where they should spend their money. So at that stage, we were talking about Ethernet in every wall. We were talking about
Yes.
sockets in lots of places. We were talking about the capacity to do large screens and multi-large screens, because that was the way it looked like things were going to go.
Hmm.
Some of it we got right, some of it we didn't. So the
Yes.
possibility of having an impact is there when it's there. So
Yeah.
take the understand the cycle
Yeah.
of it, and there's many different ways of examining the cycle. Kondratiev curves sometimes
Hmm.
have got more benefit in them than the Gartner hype cycle, but each of them has got some usefulness about them. So yes, use that and look at how much depth of understanding you need of which aspects of it, because some of it can stay superficial understanding, and some of it cannot. The total point of the whole study will be missed unless you dive deep in some aspects of any given technology.
Yes, I think many of us wired up our houses internally between rooms, not realizing the wireless revolution was going to come about in a big way.
I still use Ethernet a reasonable amount in my home network.
But yes, what a great story that is. And so true. Here's something that's really close to both our hearts, but in particular yours. You've been studying this phenomena for a long time. Uh, it's about technology impact assessment done jointly and whether you could describe this as a process plausibly. And in our case, in this DFAT grant, it's jointly between Australia and India. But in your case, it could be another type of context. But do you think impact assessments can be done jointly, and how might that look?
Yes, I've got a couple of different models that I recognise. I don't know that this is an authoritative model, uh, but the first of them I call authoritative, and that is where an organisation says we're going to do this, and it's contracted out, or a government agency does it, or a commission for the future is formed and created as a government agency to do this, and they can be done well. The Office of Technology Assessment in the US was a byword. They started it all back in the 70s through to the 90s, and it was brilliant. They were not Herman Kahn. They were much broader. They argued about their breadth. They argued about their depth. But they did a lot of good stuff. So it can be done well. But in those circumstances, the extent to which involvement of interest groups, stakeholders, advocates, and that includes for industry associations, for example. We're not only talking about human beings here. Everybody's got to have a voice. Um, the extent to which input is really going to be sought and absorbed is much more limited than with other approaches. But there are ways to do it. A second is what probably many of us would feel most comfortable with, which is what I call a coordinative or collaborative approach, where we do have multiple organizations that come together and say, all right, we know we've got some significant differences here between these three industry associations and those four advocacy associations. We've got a couple of us here playing referee a bit, and trying to make sure you guys don't get too hot-headed. We'd like you to drink together a little bit just so that you can get to understand one another's viewpoints. Now let's pull what we know and see
Yeah.
where we end up. Um, and those again can happen, but you've got to break down some barriers. You've got to have
Mm.
some level of trust, um, certainly some level of trust that things aren't being done behind your back, that this isn't just a shadow. We're only here to get your ideas, we'll suck them out of you, and then we know what to fight you with. If you've got that kind of an environment, it's not going to be a coordinative, collaborative approach, and that does happen. Those I have experienced that nastiness. Um, the third one, I use the words competitive/dialectic. So this is the let's do. I suppose it works this way. No, 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 it won't work like that. You misunderstand. There's all these other social forces at work here. It'll work like this instead. So that kind of toing and froing. Now, a lot of people aren't mature enough to do this kind of thing. Edward de Bono, Poe postulate things. You don't have to believe in it. Postulate this idea. Where does it lead us to? Can we get anything out of that? All right, that one didn't work. Push that to one side. What other one have you got for me? Kick it
Mm,
around until you find things. It's very difficult to be that flexible. Brainstorming,
yeah,
inevitably, people are desperately saying, no, that won't work because no, 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 no. Rules of brainstorming. Stop. Don't say no.
yeah,
You've got to say yes. Afterwards, we'll sort out the ones that don't work.
yeah.
It's, competitive dialectic can work, can be a lot of fun, and obviously can lead absolutely nowhere if you don't
Mm,
get it right and if you've got the right kinds of people there. To
mhm.
give us an example, people talk about Delphi studies, and of course that can work at distance. You don't have to necessarily all meet together to do it, but almost all Delphis are seeking convergence. They're simply trying to find out whose opinion wins. Well, that's pretty
Yeah,
boring, isn't it? How many years will it be before I don't know virtual reality comes back again? Since it looks
yeah,
like it's in currently subsiding. I mean, who cares? And how much? Who cares what the convergence point is? What matters is divergence.
yes,
What ideas are there? Now that you've read what the other bloke said, what things do you think they left out? What things do you think you can put as counter propositions, different propositions that are different from those? Let's
yes,
diverge. Now, at the end of it, we want to be able to say, okay, in order to do this study, we're going to have at least 7 scenarios, aren't we? We might be able to wrap all of these things together into seven. It is going to be hard work
mm,
working out what we do after that, but it's quite possible to run those. And let's face it, some of them, the ones that end up in shouting matches, are of that nature anyway. It's descriptive of how they work or don't work. So I think all three of those skilled moderators,
mm,
skilled politicians, and mature people can make any and all of those work for whoever the stakeholders are that we're working for at the time.
wow. So, on this, what are the opportunities and hindrances towards bilateral or multilateral technology impact assessment?
Yes, there's certainly the usual set, the divergence in understanding of language, even of the common language. So English isn't English. There are many Englishes. There's many dialects, and boy, do I understand that when I try to talk to younger people in the Computer Society, talk to younger people in the Privacy Foundation. uh,
Yes.
so it's an age thing and a generational thing, as well as a dialect and the way we normally think about it.
Mm,
That's one aspect, but culture cuts very deep, and culture is so many dimensioned that it's quite easy to be talking at cross purposes. If I pick a word like security, which is one of my favorites, if you don't know security of what, why, for whom, against what, if you can't agree on, I think there's six in total, but I managed to think of four. If you if you're not able to agree on what those four or six things are, you're going to be talking completely at cross purposes because you mean something completely different by the term security in your sentences. There's so
yes.
many conversations about security miss one another in the night.
Mm,
Now there's quite a few of those sorts of words, and it's very easy um, to to miss one another culturally. Now that's within one country. Leave
yeah.
aside crossing the Indian Ocean to talk to
Yeah.
one another. And of course, conservatism versus liberalism have different interpretations on different dimensions. There are different sacred cows. I mean, the English
Yes.
language uses an Indian a metaphor
Yes.
for that idea. So
Yes. Yes.
there's one
Yes.
where I've got to be careful. It may be that
Yes.
I shouldn't use that idiom when I'm talking in India. I don't know. I'm ignorant about such
Yes.
things.
Yes.
So there's so many challenges, but goodwill and open mindedness and a bit of open educatedness. Here I am as a person who has, I'll own up to it, I've never been in India.
Mm,
I've been in Colombo, but I've never been in India. So
yeah.
I'm a liability in this circumstance because I'm going to misunderstand more than most other people in the room.
Yes.
Once we have cultural divergences that where the conversation isn't quite clicking, because that which I've come up with doesn't translate in cultural terms into an Indian institutional or an Indian socio-political
Yes.
system. So
That
yes, there's lots of challenges, but goodwill, education, tolerance have got to go a long way towards it.
I think you're spot on. I mean, this intercultural awareness, this lived experience, this being patient with one another and learning about each other's perspectives. And you said listening is key to all of this, and patience in learning. And if someone does accidentally put their foot in it or make a mistake, that it's not the end of the relationship, but it's one about education through awareness raising. And um, I have been to India many, many, many times, and I hope to go back there into the future many, many times. But my kids were actually talking to me about how different India is from what they see on television from Australia, and acknowledging those differences is the first step towards dialogue, I think, and then towards doing things like these complex assessments. Uh, I think you're spot on, and I think the government, DISA, is actually currently investing quite a bit on intercultural training to do with standards. And while TIA are not standards, they may allude to technological standards in the work. Um, as a final point, I don't know if you think about rebranding TIA with other words, what and what you'd call it. Anything come to mind, or you're happy with this notion of technology impact assessment?
Provided that people using the term always understand that there are various frameworks within which assessment can be done, various drivers, various foci.
Mm,
In the event that technological impact assessment were to rule out social impact assessment, were to rule out human rights impact assessment, and so forth, that would be terrible. But the for what we're talking about with TIA, as I mean it, where there is a
yes.
technology focus or driver somewhere on the line, a significant component of the intervention is deriving from technology and technological features and affordances. When we're in a context like that, I think TIA is, for a start off, it's a much better descriptor than technological assessment. Technological assessment I've gone away from, or technology assessment I've gone away from because it's now demeaned, because government agencies don't do it very well and they do most of them. So that's one reason. That's a political reason to walk away from it. The other reason is we weren't actually assessing the technology, not for its own sake. That's
That's
something
right.
an investor does. That's something a reverse engineering person does who says, these guys have come up with what looks like a great invention. How can I reinvent something like the same thing without infringing patent? That's technology assessment.
Yes.
Technological impact assessment is much more useful to society, policy, economy, and people because it's more than just a business venture. So I'm quite comfortable with it. For I think it's got a shelf life for a while. It's
Thank you. Thank you for that feedback. As I do, Roger, we've gotten to the end of the interview. I ask all our interviewees if there was anything else they'd like to add, something I didn't ask, something they want to elaborate on. But, you know, the floor is yours for any open comments.
I guess there's two things I'd say. You've exhausted me already, but there's
I
two
hope
things I'd
not.
say. One is
Yes.
there's an interesting body of work to be done on the kinds of research techniques that are and aren't applicable in different contexts. And what we have to face up to is that
Mhm.
empirical research techniques aren't going to be great for us. We've got to be using future-oriented ones, futures
Mhm.
research techniques. The other is that one thing we've ducked completely, and I think correctly so, is that we aren't actually trying to form policy in a TIA.
Yes.
We're trying to get it to the stage where policymakers, whoever, whatever category they might be, people who are going to take messages from what we do can look at it and say, I can do something with this. This
Yeah.
gives me some stuff that will be useful to me in dealing with whatever my concept of public policy is. Um, we can certainly, I'd accept accept a commission by a client to carry on into some policy work, but I'd be really, really careful down the
Yeah.
back end because I could demean the work that I'd done that to that point because it can go in different ways.
Yeah.
I've reached that point. We've got all this information for you, but multiple different potential clienteles could leverage off that information, and narrowing it down to just one thing or just one viewpoint or policy purpose could lose some of the potential value of it. But apart from those couple of things, I think you've covered a huge amount of territory.
Well, we thank you for your time on behalf of the Social Cyber Institute, Professor Roger Clarke. Thank you for sharing so openly as you always do. I don't actually think I know of an academic in Australia that shares so openly, doesn't hoard their knowledge, and does it for the sake of education and lifting organizations and those that represent organizations and institutes and other entities. That is really inspiring. Has been from my perspective since I joined academia a while back now. But thank you for your time and your precision and talking from life experience as well as your research. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Katina. Most
Thank
enjoyable.
you. Bye bye now.
Bye.